V1. Rotate.
Let's get on to the hydraulic system. Thankfully, a little bit more straightforward. 4 hydraulic systems on the 747, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each one is equipped with a engine-driven pump and a demand pump. From what I can recall, engine 1 is a bleed air-powered demand pump, and 2 and 3 are electrically powered, and 4 has an auxiliary pump, which is used on the ground to supply hydraulic power to the brakes. This is basically the overview of which systems control which features in the 747. So all 4 systems can control the flight controls independently. System 1 is also in charge of the center autopilot, the nose and body gear retraction and extension, and the nose and body steering. Systems 2 and 3 also control autopilots. The System 2 is the right autopilot, System 3 is the left autopilot, so 3 autopilots in the 747, each one controlled by its own hydraulic system. System 4 is the little quirky one with the extra auxiliary pump. It controls the wing landing gear, retraction and extension, and the normal braking systems, which is why, when we'll go back into the flight deck, we'll see that it has an aux pump. So the auxiliary pump on the system number 4 is used on the ground to provide pressure and to the brakes, essentially. So with the just checking here, the hydraulic brake pressure, it's in the green. We've selected the auxiliary so we can set the parking brakes and make sure that all of the ground services can be completed. So this switch remains in the auxiliary position until after the pushback, when we begin the engine start sequence and we start pressurizing the hydraulics. Alright, let's get this over with. One of the quirkiest things about the 747 is the fuel system. I love to hate it or hate to love it, whichever one you want to choose from. It's a very interesting and unique challenge to understand what exactly is going on with the fuel system, how to load the aircraft properly, and what the fuel is doing, and which fuel tanks are supplying fuel to which engines. That's the biggest challenge in this aircraft. Once you kind of wrap your head around it and understand the logic, it kind of starts to make sense, but you really do have to keep an eye on it. Now, just like any other system that we've talked about before, it's semi-automatic in that it kind of opens and closes certain valves automatically, and the logic kind of goes from one tank to another, but there is still a little bit of pilot input because buttons and switches. So let's get started on the aircraft. Let's start with the fuel tanks first. So the short and sweet of it, 4 main wing tanks, 1 reserve tank on either end, and a center fuel tank, plus the stab tank. I forgot to put in stab. Hang on. The stab tank is basically kind of like an extra reserve. It's in the back of the aircraft. It's used for weight and balance on the ground to make sure that the center of gravity is in the right place. So depending on the weight and balance of the aircraft, they can choose to put a little bit of extra fuel in there. As the center tank burns off, the stab tank feeds the center tank. That's all we need to know about that for now. So if you do have fuel in the stab tank, those pumps will pump it into the center tank, which will feed certain engines depending on the configuration of the aircraft. So back into the flight deck, because this one is going to get a little bit complicated. Okay, so each wing tank has a forward and an aft pump. You can turn all of those on now. Cool. We'll get to the other ones in a second. The stab tanks both have a pump. Center tank is equipped with 2 fuel pumps. These are actually stronger than the main wing tanks. They are override jettison pumps, so their pressure is greater than main tank pumps. The wing tanks 2 and 3, so the inboard wing tanks, also have override jettison pumps. Those are also selectable via the overhead here. There are 4 crossfeed valves. These here should remain open at all times and guarded. The outboard ones are controlled by the pilot depending on what the fuel's doing. So, in the air, with fuel in the center tank, the fuel will be provided to all 4 engines, so the fuel crossfeed, the 1 and 4 fuel crossfeed valves need to be open because the center wing tank will be providing fuel to all 4 engines. Now that's in the air. When, again in the air, the center tank is depleted, then the override pumps kick in, and main tanks 2 and 3 will provide fuel to all 4 engines, provided that the amount of fuel in wing tanks 2 and 3 is greater than the outboard tanks. So currently we have 38.1 tons in the inner tanks, and in the outboard engine tanks, the outboard wing tanks, we have 13.6. So that is greater than. So once we fire everything up, in the air at least, with no fuel in the center tank, the override pumps, which are stronger than regular pumps, will be feeding all 4 engines via the crossfeed valves. Exception. When the flaps are lowered for takeoff and there is fuel in all of the tanks, the center tank singular will be providing fuel to the outboard engines 4 and 1, and the main tanks will be providing fuel to the inboard engines. In the air, when there is no more fuel in the center tank, and the outboard tanks are equal to the inboard tanks, then all 4 tanks will be providing fuel to their respective engines, so we can close the override pumps. I know it's a lot to think about, especially on the ground in an abstract kind of way, which is why I finally want to get us rolling here out of Boston and get us up in the air, and we can monitor the fuel situation on the way over to Munich.